We're going to now talk about the final parts of the Reconstruction process in the United States. I want to look today starting at the way that the Southern society was restructured or attempted to be restructured by the radical Republicans in Congress, who ended up pretty much having control because they almost removed President Johnson from office with impeachment. Even though that didn't succeed, they still had that majority in Congress to override any veto that he should make. So I want to go back real quick to something that the radicals had put in place starting in 1867, when the South was organized into 5 military districts with troops placed in each district. This would ensure that Southern states would comply with the laws and regulations that the radicals in Congress created. It also made it possible for the Southern states to become a part of the new government of the United States, as long as they followed with radical Republican ideals. Pretty much that was the majority with accepting the 14th Amendment, which was guarantees of citizenship and equal protection under the law for all people, not just whites. Once they were able to take control, these are the things that they had to face. There were 3 groups of people that needed to be addressed when it came to who had an interest in how the new Southern society was going to look. Obviously, there were Southern whites. Many of those had been supporters of the Confederacy, freedmen, and many Northerners who moved into the Southern states. Some of them were for greedy reasons. They thought they could make a profit off of the devastation in the South. Some went for humanitarian reasons, to help freedmen get on their feet and also to assist in rebuilding efforts. The struggle between these 3 groups of people to achieve their individual goals led to a lot of problems that the government was not able to completely address. These problems included corruption, crime, and terrorism, such as groups like the KKK forming. These are the main issues when it came to the labor system of the South and land issues, which was probably the biggest thing that needed to be addressed because so much of that involved the ideals and the usage of slavery from before the Civil War. Obviously, because of most of the fighting taking place on the southern land, a lot of the landscape of the South was completely devastated by the war and would need to be rebuilt as far as factory equipment, towns, roads, bridges. And there wasn't a whole lot of money, or what you see here, investment capital, available to rebuild these places. Many people did not have money to finance these efforts or to sell bonds to people to buy to help finance these efforts, so it would be very difficult to rebuild without money. There had to be some type of new labor system to replace slavery because now slavery no longer existed. Those who had been slaves were comfortable with the work that they had done before as far as the agricultural work. And as freedmen, many of them desired to work together with groups of freedmen instead of just having individual family farms. This kind of went against some of the northern thoughts about what makes a good economy. In the north, because of it being industrialized, it was more about individuals and individual families doing their own work in factories. They didn't necessarily work in large groups with other families. However, because of the slaves' experience on the plantations and farms that they had worked on before the Civil War, they were used to working in large groups, so they wanted to continue that now as freedmen. During the Civil War, General William Sherman, the guy who did the total war approach in the March to the Sea, he had actually set aside some areas of Georgia and South Carolina that were supposed to be designated for freedmen once the Civil War was over. He had actually made promises to these slaves at the time that they would receive 40-acre plots and an animal to begin their lives as freed people. And it was called the 40 Acres and a Mule Dream. The Freedmen's Bureau was going to be the group that was going to confiscate the land from these states and then redistribute them to these newly freed people. And this did not exactly happen the way that they had planned out because President Johnson, in his plan for Reconstruction, had given himself an escape clause, if you remember from the first recording, where he could grant individual pardons to any Southerner who was excluded from taking a part in Southern society in the future. And because he could give individualized pardons to whoever he wanted, many of these people were not forced to give up their land. So therefore, the Freedmen's Bureau could not redistribute it to the freedmen. As a result, most of the freedmen were left with hardly any hope of becoming landowners themselves one day. And because of this, massive amounts of poverty could be found among the population of freedmen. Since there was really no other alternative, because many freed slaves did not have industrial types of skills or other ways to make a living other than agriculture, there was a system that ended up replacing the slave system, and it wasn't that much better than the slave system. It was called sharecropping, and I really want you to focus in on this description of what it is. The idea behind sharecropping was that these freedmen would work for a landlord, not a slave master, but for a landowner. And that landowner would provide the freedmen with seeds and other types of equipments, and usually it wasn't enough given to the person. And in return for farming the land and for the freedmen being able to live on the land to work, the landlord would require a share of the harvest in the end of the crops that were grown. Usually it was 50%, sometimes higher, that the freedmen, the laborer, would have to give to the landlord. There was a lot of risks involved in this, because if the crop happened to fail, the tenant farmer or the freedman, in this case any type of freed slave that was now working for a landowner, if the crop failed, that person would then be in debt, because they would still be expected to pay back the seed and equipment that the landlord had let them use. Another danger besides crop failure was if the prices of certain crops dropped for whatever reason, then the landlord would usually increase the percentage of what was required to be given to him by the freedmen, because that landlord would have to make up for the fall in prices. Additionally, since the landlords usually did not give enough supplies and seeds to the freedmen to work, that freedman would usually have to go to some type of a creditor or an individual that could sell them seeds and other types of equipments. And because they didn't have the money to buy it at first, they would have to buy those things on credit, and those people that were selling those things, the seeds and equipment, could charge high prices and high interest rates. So therefore, if the freedman wasn't left with enough of the crop portions of profit in the end, then they couldn't pay their debts to these creditors for the seeds and farm supplies that they had bought, because they weren't given enough by the landlord. So pretty much the bottom line with sharecropping is that they were left with hardly any profit to get on their feet, and therefore they could never really get to the point where they could buy a piece of land on their own and provide for their own family. So they were continually left in a state that was pretty much like slavery, except it wasn't called slavery. These Republicans in Congress were aware of these issues, and in addition to that, there were some other issues that had to be addressed, some successfully, some not so successfully. People, like I had mentioned in the last slide, that moved from the north to the south to take advantage of the situation or just honestly to help out were known as carpetbaggers. Many of these did have a negative reputation because the Southerners saw them as just people out to get some type of advantage and make a buck or two off the suffering of the Southerners and the fact that they were trying to get back on their feet. Many of these individuals actually came to the southern states with small bags made out of carpet containing their materials, containing whatever property they had. So they were nicknamed carpetbaggers. There were also whites in the South who were for the radical Republicans in Congress and what they were doing. These people obviously weren't appreciated by other whites in the South, and therefore they were labeled scalawags, which is like a Scottish term for a scoundrel, or someone that you definitely don't think highly of. So because of the fact that many Southerners resented the types of people in the South that were beginning to not only take advantage economically of the situation, but these people were also getting elected into the southern state governments. And so many white Southerners were concerned that their new state governments would not represent what they truly wanted for their states. In addition to this, there were demands by other groups of people that needed certain types of assistance to get on their feet. Poor white farmers that were poor before the Civil War, now they wanted to make sure, because we know President Johnson was definitely against the rich white Southerners, and they saw that this is an opportunity for them. They wanted to make sure that the new state governments in the South would give them some type of aid against these wealthy landowners that still had some money even after the Civil War. And of course, the freedmen, they wanted to be able to vote, to go to school, to have same rights as whites, to be able to own land if they could ever get to that point. And so all of these demands by these different groups, plus the views of certain people that were viewed as just out to make a profit or to take advantage, made it very difficult for the southern state governments to fix the problems and to get the South back on its feet. There were some accomplishments because of the radical Republicans implementing some laws and changes for the South. New legislators were elected that were African American for the first time. You can see some names down here. And so that kind of showed that they could have more of a say in how the state governments were going to look in the future. You can see some other accomplishments here. Things like hospitals, roads, and bridges were built or rebuilt, and schools were put into place that were state supported. And so basically the accomplishments showed that people could have more equality and that the South could be rebuilt and helped to get back on its feet. So there were some good things about the radical Republicans' decisions in Congress. However, there were also some failures. You can see that just like in any government that you look at, even today, there are people in the government that get caught up in scandals, they take bribes, and this was definitely true in the southern state governments. There was actually a financial panic that happened in 1873, not as bad as the Great Depression of the 1930s or even some of the other recessions that we've had, but this was the result of some of these politicians who had acted irresponsibly with the money. And so in this panic of 1873, many southern state governments were forced to the edge of bankruptcy. And so there was definitely some failures in addition to the positive things of the Republicans in Congress making decisions for the South. Finally, you can see down here that when it came to the freedmen, they did get some new rights that were of equal importance to whites. They were allowed to formally marry legally. And then they were also able to go to things that they had previously not been able to, such as their own churches, fraternal and benevolent associations. Like today, you might think of the Loyal Order of the Orioles or something like that. That would be an example of an association like this. Obviously, schools and other types of political organizations like political party clubs, they can now be a part of. So definitely Republican Reconstruction had its benefits, but also its failures. So finally, let's look quickly at why Reconstruction came to an end. Like I mentioned in the last screen, there was a lot of corruption and politicians that got caught up in scandals. Ulysses Grant, who was the hero of the North, the general that led the North to victory during the Civil War, he was elected as president in 1868 after the whole issue with Andrew Johnson almost ended with impeachment. But as a president, he was definitely less effective than as a general. His administration was blamed for all kinds of schemes and scandals and inconsistency in what to do with the South. And because of this, some of the Republicans that were in Congress lost their positions because a lot of people were kind of fed up with Grant, who was a Republican. And some of the new people that began to get elected in the Congress were called spoilsmen. And these were politicians who continued what Grant was doing with the corruption. They would give their jobs to people who supported them, their friends, rather than to who honestly wanted to help the South. So some of those radical Republicans in Congress with good motives were replaced by people who were like the president, just out to take advantage and be corrupt and take part in schemes. You can see some of the schemes here that came about during President Grant's administration. These were definitely terrible things for any government official to get involved in, and all it did was make people feel bad about the government and not trust them. We mentioned the Panic of 1873 had lots of bad effects on the Reconstruction process because money was a big concern. You can see some of the issues with money down here. The idea of what was going to be used for currency had to be decided. There was paper money issued during the Civil War called greenbacks, but there were a lot of people who thought that those should be taken out now that the war was over and replace and go back to what they had, which was hard money, gold and silver coins. With all of these issues going on within the government, many Southerners saw this as their chance to take advantage of the fact that the radical Republican thought in Congress was starting to weaken because of all the people involved in scandals and schemes and manipulation. So there were some Southern conservatives that were from the Democrat Party that decided that this was their opportunity to start voting for themselves again. And because the radicals in Congress weren't as powerful anymore, they got away with it. These people were called Redeemers, and they were all about putting the South back on the track that it had been before the Civil War, which would include groups to stop the protection of African Americans and laws to basically dismantle what the radical Republicans had done since the end of the Civil War.